Is it? I'm trying to look at the invisibility of the women in Indian history, and I will limit myself to the Vedic period, which includes the Rigvedic as well as later Vedic period, and dispel the notion that this was a golden period in the history of Indian womanhood. So I would first of all like to relate it with history. Whether it is learned formally or not, it is a process of internalization of the past, acquired through agencies such as mythology, folklore, popular belief, and orally narrated tales of heroism and chivalry. Formal history often finds its way to people in more or less changed form in contemporary times through media, audio, video, and print, which normally includes newspapers, journals, debates, etc., that lead us to the formation of certain ideas and develop our understanding of the events of the past. This history, the formal history, is perceived by most as a study of the achievements of the conquest, heroism of the illustrious rulers and emperors, as well as the political, socio-economic and religious conditions of that era. Now, the beginning of Indian history can be traced to Harappan civilization, as we all know that the language has not been deciphered, so we are not in a position to exactly tell what situations may have been, but from the findings that we have, we come to the conclusion that it was a matrilineal society, a matriarchal society with women at the helm of affairs. So there's no question of invisibility, the woman is very well visible here. I move on to the next period, which is the period of the Rigvedic period, where one comes across women enjoying free life with sexual freedom, and widow remarriage, no child marriage, and women in this society appear as a field of the family for raising the crop of children, and hence the system of Niyog or the Levy. At the same time, there's a reference to contract marriage, that of Urvashi with Pururuvas. We come across Swayamvar, marriage by capture, monogamy, polygamy, polyandry. And this period, this era, has been very beautifully called by Uma Chakrabarti as the golden age of Indian womanhood. The Rigvedicarians, let's not forget, were patriarchal, with men having almost absolute control over wife and children. In spite of this, her position was much higher than that later on. Women took part in intellectual and spiritual life of the community, sacrifices and oblations offered jointly by husband and wife, and a very rosy picture indeed, but no property rights for women. One also comes across women composers of the Brahmavadini, as we call them, Vishwara, Apala, Ghosha, Lopamudra, Shashi, Yashi, Indrayani, and Sachi. But not much detail is known about these women, except for the fact that these women were the women from the Brahmin Varna, a privileged few. The question is, as compared to the vast majority of men, these are too less in numbers, and so what about the rest? Where were the other women and how were they represented? Was their position in the what was their position in the family, in the society? What was the system of education for them? These are some of the questions whose answers are conspicuously absent, and hence a large chunk of population of the females remain invisible in this period of Indian history. That's not all, but further the position of women deteriorates relatively during the later Vedic period, with the development of the belief that only sons could redeem their parents from the hell, and the daughters being incapable for this. This had for far-reaching implications, as it led to a decline in the women's position as vehicles of bearing sons or else useless. Now these ideas further supported in the Atharva Ved, in the Brahmanas, in the Upanishads, and have percolated down to the contemporary period also. Let me quote a hymn from the Atharva Veda. It says, O Prajapati, Anumati, Shinivala, Shinivali, give a daughter elsewhere, but here a male. A curious notion can be seen developing in the later Vedic literature, which says that embryos were essentially male, and the birth of daughter was due to the perverse activity of the malignant spirits who, during the course of development of the fetus, turned it into female. Atharva says to this effect, O Pinga, defend thou the child in the process of birth, let not the evil one turn the male into a female, which is quite a revealing exposition. Thus one comes across a whole Brahman of the 6th chapter of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is devoted to the ceremonial of a son. It says, women is conjectured as a Vedi of the sacrifice, and the son the fruit of the offering obtained for the benefit in the next world. We come across Punsavan Sanskar, an important ceremony of the 16th Sanskar, actually which means male producing, which is performed in the 3rd month of the pregnancy. We further come across stories that highlight Harishchandra, who has 100 wives but has no son, and the counsel of his learned Brahmins to his court reveals that it says, a son is a board of salvation, a light in the highest heaven, a wife is a comrade, but a daughter a misery. Thus the Atharvaved deprecates daughters' birth, but the Brahmanas seem more unfavorable towards women with the concept of ceremonial purity and examples of people who disposed of their daughters in their infancy. So a system that we are still trying to fight out with the female feticide, it sees its presence in the Brahmin literature itself. Thus the later Vedic texts further aided and led to the process of subjugation of these women and further complete subservience to men from their place as co-partners with men in the Rig Vedic society. And that's not all. Another interesting instance comes from the Maitrayani Samhita, which places women at par with dice and drink and describes her as one of the major evils in the society. And Taittiriya Samhita and Shatpat Brahman further rank her as inferior to a bad man. If a woman was sterile, this could be another reason for a man to remarry. But what was the worst was that if she bore all daughters, which doesn't seem to be too alien, and this is a legacy of the text which is continuing practice even till today, adding on to the woe of Indian women. Though it may be argued that not all Indo-Aryans followed the injunctions of these texts, or the local customs and usages may have had their influence on them. However, the Upanishads, they have a different picture, and we have foreigners such as Max Muller, and we have Mrs. Speer, and we have a couple of other historians who have tried to paint a very glorious picture of Indian womanhood in the Rig Vedic period. However, we have some historians who have even pictured a very, very dark era of women in this era. But the gloomy picture of this womanhood reflected in the later Vedic text impacted the visibility of women, which was already too little in the early Vedic period. The names that now appear quite often are that of Gargi and Maitreyi, the names very frequently referred to by the historians to highlight their intellectual accomplishment and to establish the high status and place of honor to Aryan women. Again, this is a case of privileged women who have been exceptions to the rule, and the question remains unanswered: where are the women? The larger chunk. And further related to is another question, the answer to which has not been found from times immemorial: whose history is it? So taking in entirety, a society consists of both men and women, and the formal history is, as understood, is all male dominated. If at all certain women surface, their number remains minuscule. Thus, the 50% of the males in the society also take the place of almost 50% of the females, making women totally invisible within the patriarchal setup. And that's not all. When we talk about the 4 Varnas, we see that the Varnas appearing from the body parts of Brahma, the male god, leaving the rest in obscurity. The ashram further catered to the males, charting out the roles and the responsibilities of the Aryan men, intricately linking it up with the Purushats, further leaving that of women unanswered. So this is a pertinent question that arises again. Whose history is it? Is this a history of subjugation of the other half, in which one is not reflected, has no voice, no rights, in fact no visibility? Is it possible to transform the situation and look at history from a different perspective? Is it possible to change the way of thinking without demolishing patriarchy, which of course is a clue to this invisible status? The answer to these questions are influenced by the nature and extent of all pervading norms, values and beliefs that are related to gender. It lies in challenging patriarchy and changing the stereotypical way of thinking by initiating gender justice. This challenge has been taken up by the historians by rewriting history from a women's perspective to make the women across all diversities visible. Thank you.
And I am a Democrat at core, at heart. So can we have 10 minutes of participation? Few select questions, very brief. Or comments. You can go there because otherwise everyone will not be able to hear. But be brief, please.
This question is for Rajiv sir. Sir, what is the criteria which stimulates people to examine the concept of inclusion?
And your name, please.
I am Aarti Sharma from the Department of Sociology.
Shall we have the question?
Dear student, my question is to Rajiv sir. What are the institutional arrangements associated with formal, informal spaces which make social inclusion a possibility?
Okay. Any other question or comment? Yes, please.
Ma'am, India being a religious country, how can we evade those ancient literatures and those aspects because they are so prominent?
Okay.
Because nobody will follow, and how is it possible to make them aware of the patriarchy persisting in those literatures?
Okay, right. You want somebody specifically to answer?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Any other question? Then I'll ask Professor Rajiv Gupta to please.
Aarti has raised an important issue. What are those indicators by which we can conceptualize social inclusion? In fact, in the beginning, I tried to make this argument that monopoly capitalism is the major source for social exclusion. So ideologically, the answer will be, if you can control over this process, then probably inclusion is the possibility. But definitely, participatory democracy means functional participation in decision-making process and participation in achieving certain goals. If these two things go together with a sense of equality, then probably to an extent inclusion can be made. We can also create a checklist in terms of yes and no. Yes and no in terms of continuum, in the field of education, in the field of health, in the field of participation in informal and formal structures, in terms of protest, participation in various movements, and then if that checklist is prepared on the basis of the what kind of role we perform in several structures and institutions, then probably inclusion process can be created. As far as informal and formal institutions are concerned, we can locate social exclusion everywhere. If we move with race, caste, religion, ethnicity, rural-urban divide, if you can create social composition of state, social composition of society, and then check yourself where you are allowed to participate and you are not allowed to make any intervention. If these things are elaborated in context of family, in terms of neighborhood, in terms of kinship, in terms of caste, in terms of class, then probably the role of institutional and informal structures can be located. My basic argument in this context is, when we talk about social exclusion, we must stress upon those processes which are making the issue of monopoly capitalism rational. If you are rationalizing monopoly capitalism, then probably exclusion is also legitimized. If you attack on it, then the issue of inclusion can be created, and I have spoken very clearly that social exclusion, inclusion issues are associated with post-Cold War economy. It is nothing to do with the earlier one where exploitation, subjugation, inequalities, they were talked about. So whenever you talk about these two processes, please go through what post-Cold War economy is doing for the society.
Thank you, Professor Rajiv Gupta. So that gives me 5 minutes to share my ideas with you. I'll try to impose the time limit on myself as well. Well, I have no hesitation in saying that this has been a very, very good beginning of the seminar. Professor Rajiv Gupta gave a strong ideological and theoretical foundation to the subject, and all the other presenters were also focused. And a variety of issues were brought in from sociological, from economic, from economics point of view, from the humanities point of view, from literary point of view, from history point of view. And so I begin with the last question. The young student was right in saying that we cannot disown our past, we cannot disown our scriptures, we cannot disown our history. Yes, we cannot. We know the roots of oppression are there. We know the roots of liberation are also there to an extent. We know the patriarchal structure is strongly embedded in those structures and normative values. Right. But the question is, do we look at them critically? Do we interrogate them? Do we see them in the context of our present? Because when we contextualize any text, any idea, any ideology, I think the focal point has to be our present situation. Only then it is relevant. So I am not a votary of ignoring the past, but I am a votary of looking at the past with critical eyes, with a strong focus on what we are actually looking at and for what reasons. If we are looking at some kind of way out for our present situation, for our problems, then it is a welcome step, but not just for the sake of culturally satisfying ourselves and living in a glorified era or in a euphoria or in a nauseating kind of a cultural glory that I think is not going to serve our purpose. So let us look at the past critically. And somebody talked about, I think Nisha talked about the Gandhian economic vision. The Gandhian vision as a whole is very relevant to interrogate ourselves. Gandhi was probably the first political thinker activist who asked for reviewing our history, reviewing our traditions, reviewing our culture, and he said that if those cultural traits do not agree with my dignity as a person, I may not be obliged to follow all those traditions, those scriptures, those values. So the liberating vision, as I find in Gandhi, may be a way out. Well, I would agree with Professor Rajiv Gupta that the whole discourse of social exclusion is a post-Cold War discourse, and it is strongly rooted in the neoliberal ideology. There is enough evidence to suggest that it is buttressed, it is strengthened by the neoliberal ideology. But I would go a step further, which probably he did not go today, I don't know why, that this process is not inevitable. I would not subscribe to the TINA objective, that there is no alternative. There are always alternatives. And we cannot exonerate the nation states by saying that we are living in a globalizing era, we are living in a neoliberal era, where the states do not have sovereignty enough, their sovereignty is compromised, their power is compromised, and that they cannot take enough hard decisions to deliver. So I would not subscribe to the view that globalization and neoliberalism gives a leeway to the present state structure. Of course, neoliberalism is a very strong presence, and it has heightened inequalities in every field, not only in economic field, it has also aggravated the social conflicts, it has also aggravated the cultural schisms, it has a political agenda. So I would say it is also a power discourse simultaneously. We just cannot look at all these forces only as social or as economic. There is a power content which is very much there, which is actually driving force of all this. So the whole social exclusion discourse is ideologically driven, it is also power driven. So as Professor Rajiv Gupta said, that let us look at the opposite of exclusion in case we want to get rid of it. It is inclusion in a very literal sense, but what is inclusion? Is it integration? Is it incorporation? Probably neoliberalism is looking at incorporation, which is dangerous. And I am reminded of a text by Herbert Marcuse in 1964. I am quite fond of it. I have been talking about him quite a lot. In 1964, Herbert Marcuse wrote a book which is very famous, and you must have read it, One-Dimensional Man, One-Dimensional Consciousness. That is what we are finding today. When we are trying to see, when we see that ideology is being replaced by technology. And when this happens, you do not have the sanctity of ideas. You do not have the sanctity of democratic culture of thought. You do not have the sanctity of critically orienting and diversifying. Selfhood. Somebody talked about selfhood, dignity of person. So selfhood is actually the antidote to any exclusionary activity at one point. At another point, of course, the collective sphere, the collective endeavor has to be there. And so I would again go a step further, which Rajiv ji did not go today. I think the time for such a politics may not have passed even today. So I would still look for areas where consciousness is raised, where empowerment strategies are in place, as our friend Nilesh Kumar said, where inclusive policies are in place, as all our other friends said, but where a complete interrogation is needed, because I think that is the, as our classical liberals said, which we may not support otherwise, but very rightly they said, the price for democracy is eternal, the price for liberty is eternal vigilance. And so vigilance and selfhood are probably important antidotes to this all-pervasive process of exclusion at our own individual level, although the collective endeavor has to be there on the part of civil society, on the part of the state, and on the part of the creative thinking people, including the young and the old, and especially people from the universities. Thank you so much.
Exclusion in the sphere of social interaction and social relations comes into existence. In my opinion, discrimination, oppression, atrocities and systematic hierarchies are products or byproducts of this lack of participation. Exclusion on the basis of caste can be observed as a specific reality in the Indian subcontinent. On the other hand, caste constructs exclusion by and large in countries where financial capital plays an instrumental role. Gender-based exclusion is a universal reality because of various forms of patriarchy that determine man-woman relationship in all parts of society. These trends of exclusion lead to multiple pathological consequences. The second technical session aims to highlight the extent and magnitude of caste, class, gender-based exclusion. And now I hand over to the compare.
On contemporary Indian society and social inclusion, challenges and strategies. The topic of the session is caste, class, gender-based exclusion, extent and magnitude. I request Professor Harish Doshi, the chairperson of the session, Professor Asha Kaushik and Dr. Rashmi Jain, invited speakers to please take their seats on the dais.
Professor Doshi has retired from VSNG University, Surat in 2002 and has continued his association there as advisor to the Vice Chancellor. Presently, he is a member of research boards and academic bodies of different universities in India. He has supervised 13 PhDs and 6 MPhils and has authored 6 books. His research interest is urban sociology and issues related to marginalization and social exclusion. We welcome you, sir. I now request Professor Nisha Yadav, convener of the conference, to offer floral greetings to Professor Doshi. Our first speaker, Professor Asha Kaushik, specializes in the field of political theory, gender studies, the Gandhian thought and developmental studies. She has a number of books and publications to her credit in the national and international journals. I now request Professor Deepa Parekh to offer floral greetings to Professor Kaushik. Our second speaker, Professor Rashmi Jain, is the Director at Center for Exclusion and Inclusion, University of Rajasthan, Jaipur. Dr. Jain is an Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology, University of Rajasthan. Her academic pursuits have taken her to various countries of the world and has contributed a large number of publications. We welcome you, ma'am. I request Dr. Aarti Sharma to welcome Dr. Jain with flowers. I request the chairperson, Professor Doshi, to take over for subsequent proceedings.
My colleagues on the panel, Professor Asha Kaushik and Rashmi Jain, and other friends present here. The caste, gender, class, and these are the issues which have very intimately to deal with exclusion and inclusion processes. Right from the morning, Professor Jain and later Professor Vyas put entire theme of the conference in proper perspective, and the subsequent presentations, admirable presentation. And one thing very special about that was that whatever was discussed and presented in terms of exclusion processes, exclusion and inclusion historically as well as in present context, I think most strengthful point was that the material was drawn from different disciplines, and the contention of the presentation was that this is a kind of process which has emanated right from the historical period and perpetuated with different, global processes. And even today, apprehension is that it is becoming more challenging than what it was perhaps in the past, because the institutional setups are such which, as Rajiv has said, are such which are rather, strengthening, reinforcing in different, views with different institutions, different mindsets, agencies, which includes right from political, groups to the media and the press and all those things. Now, this is the crux of the entire thing: caste, class, gender. This is the thrust of the entire social processes. And I think Professor Asha Kaushik is one of the authority available to us, and she has been here throughout the day, and her presentation and handling the entire session is encouraging. I have learned a lot of things from her, and Rashmi, she is already head of the center in the Assam University, and I think she will be speaking on gender, and we all will be richly benefited by their presentation. I won't take much time because time is scarce and there are large number of speakers. So we will decide later. First I will invite Professor Asha Kaushik, and later she has been a chairperson in the morning, so she knows the constraints. So I don't need to tell her anything. And Madam Rashmi also will take care of that part. Because here about 10 oral presentations are there. So everybody will be disciplined in terms of times. These two say scholars have freedom to choose their time between 20 and 25 minutes, and others will follow as I will ration the time later. So they are free to take any say time between 20 and 25 minutes. Yes, madam.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Doshi. Although in the first session we have had a lot of discussion on the theoretical aspects, but I'll preface my presentation. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Let me just talk in terms of raising some issues so that we can have more discussion. I'll preface my presentation with a few remarks on the theoretical aspects which were not covered in the morning session. Professor Rajiv Gupta did begin with the Marxist orientation of Marxist interpretation of the processes of exclusion, the concepts of expropriation, exploitation, and class being misappropriated by the neoliberal agenda. But may I just put things in a historical perspective and begin with the very beginnings, that is the Industrial Revolution followed by the liberal neoclassical economic thought, which was based on what we call in political theory possessive individualism. This possessive individualism has great lineage to its credit, the contractualists and later on the later liberal theorists, and they all talked about the entitlements, the rights of the individual, especially in terms of property, and this whole conceptualization of possessive individualism resulted in strengthening the capitalist forces. And so the economic system in those societies was organized around the capitalist industrial logic of development. And since that time, 17th century and 18th century onwards, this has actually formed the bedrock of all economic activity and economic development in subsequent centuries. So what we today call the mainstream development model is actually based on this classical liberal model of development. Now, during the subsequent centuries, this was challenged, of course, in 19th century by Karl Marx and the transformation theory, the transformative revolution theory of Karl Marx, and it was said that this economic model cannot lead to an egalitarian society, cannot result in what today we call an inclusive society. So it was said in the Marxist literature, Marx and later Marxist thought, that this challenge has to be developed, has to be challenged, this model has to be challenged, and therefore we had a whole tradition of the collectivist thinking or the revolutionary thinking or the social transformation theories. So by the beginning of the 20th century, we had these two models of development, the Marxist model of development, the socialist model of development, and the liberal model of development. However, the mainstream development model has continued to be liberal. The Marxist model was always thought of as challenging the mainstream liberal model, and for historical forces which right now I have no time to deliberate upon that. In 1990s we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the socialist regimes supported by the Soviet Union, and then the new processes of what today we call neoliberal forces, globalization forces, liberalization forces. This phase began in 1990s, and the neoclassical approach of the 18th century was converted into and developed into the neoliberal approach of the 20th century, late 20th century. So today, as Rajiv ji very rightly said in the morning, that when we address the social exclusion discourse, we are actually addressing this scenario of late 20th century, when we see on the one hand the collapse of the socialist alternative in political parlance, and it was said, or it was romanticized, that end of history thesis of Fukuyama is probably the only thesis, and that revolution will not occur now, as if colonialism had never been defeated, as if socialist revolutions had never taken place. Despite all that, it was said in late 20th century that now there is only one way, and that is the neoliberal, liberalization-based, globalization-based path of development. Now this development, because it is based on this neoclassical and neoliberal economic vision of development, there are certain inherent assumptions which may be called flaws in this whole development vision. And the inherent assumption is that market has its own logic, that development works through economic growth, that development is synonymous with economic growth, and economic growth is facilitated through competition, through competitive market economics, through competitive market relations, and therefore to talk of equality is actually meaningless. Because if you have a competitive market system, only those who have the capacity, only those who have the capability, quote unquote skills, marketability, read as skills, trained through the market mechanism itself. So, what is the criterion of development then? The criterion is this marketability of skills that individuals may possess at a given particular time in a given context. Now this is buttressed by, facilitated by the further growth of the hegemonic dimensions of capitalism. Now this capitalism is no longer monopoly capitalism today. It is also a capitalism by proxy. It is also a capitalism which functions on paperless money. It is also a capitalism which has a hidden agenda, which we may not be able to pinpoint. So corporate capitalism functions through multinational corporations, which has a less tangible character compared to the earlier capitalism against which Karl Marx was fighting. So my submission is that when we say that the category of exploitation is being expropriated by the category of exclusion, my submission is that that form of tangibility of exploitation itself has been diluted by the capitalist market, by market forces, in terms of incorporating the very forces which were fighting against those exploiting forces. The working class has been incorporated, has been divided, has been made dysfunctional by the intervention of technology. Now we do not have the factory based production, we do not have the manual labor production. So the entire process of labor has been transformed in such a way that to talk of a solidarity of a working class has not been possible probably since 1960s, and therefore when I was talking about the emergence of neo-Marxism, some of my Marxist friends said that neo-Marxism was diluting Marxism, but my submission has been that neo-Marxism was a response to the changing character of production and consumption and the changing character of solidarity within societies and at the global level. So this led to emergence of global capitalism, and as one of the leading sociologists, Seclair, has written quite comprehensively, that today, even today, when we talk of the nation state, we are not talking of the nation state as a space. The reference point is always global capitalism, because the nation state is working under the pressure of the international organizations, whether WTO, whether Bretton Woods institutions such as International Monetary Fund or other institutions, even the United Nations to some extent. So my submission is that when we talk of social exclusion today, probably we are talking of deprivations of the majority of the people, sometimes in terms of class, sometimes in terms of caste as we do in India, and sometimes in terms of gender as is being talked in all over the world globally, and also in terms of the young and the old, in terms of age, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of regions. There are so many categories in which exclusion is being talked about. Now, how do we distinguish exclusion from all these kinds of exploitation, marginalization, deprivation, and maybe divisions within a society and outside a society? In my humble opinion, exclusion is done by a group to the other group. It is not so much individual as collective. It is also related to an identity. So when we talk of individual disability of a person, probably it may be thought of as a specific case. Probably it may be thought of as a case in terms of lack of accessibility to resources, lack of educational attainments, lack of income, accessibility to reasonable income. So all these things may be said in that way, that when we talk of individual deficiencies, we probably think of that in terms of rights, in terms of capabilities. But when we use the term exclusion, we are usually using the term in a group sense, in terms of an identity, in terms of community, so that it is disabling of a group of people because of maybe some cultural characteristics, maybe because of some social features, maybe because of some location in a place. So usually the term social exclusion is used in that sense. Now coming to the Indian system, because Nishaji has shifted me to this session, so I'll be talking about the Indian scenario here. And when we talk of India, we are actually emphasizing on the unique characteristics of the Indian society or the Indian social, economic, political system distinct from other places. Social exclusion has been a phenomenon in the West as well. In the United Kingdom, as we were talking over tea, in 1997, a social exclusion unit was instituted, and that is controlled by the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So they have addressed this problem of social exclusion in terms of economic distribution. In the West, social exclusion has been described and discussed in terms of class affiliations, class distinctions. Although it is not it is not used in the sense, in the way in which Marx used the word class, in terms of consciousness, in terms of class contradictions. In the Western literature, in the neo-liberal era, if we look at the books published on social exclusion in Western literature, we'll see that income distribution is the major focus of their studies, and the haves and have-nots in terms of income distributions, people in upper income group and people in lower income group are divided. So it is said that those who do not have the middle range of income group, they are excluded. And that is usually termed as class distinction in the Western societies, in the US as well as in the United Kingdom and Europe. In India, we are referring to social exclusion. It has been deliberately or it has been specifically done in terms of caste. And the UGC chairman, former UGC chairman, Professor Sukhdev Thorat, was the major person to have come out with a major theorization on caste as the exclusion category in India. He says that when we talk of social exclusion in India, it has to be studied in terms of caste-based social exclusion, and when he discusses this, he has described it in terms of graded inequality. He says that caste inequality in India is not a general category, it is a graded inequality because caste is hierarchical, and therefore each caste has a different kind of power mechanics as well as the social authority mechanics. So he says that we have to address this problem of graded inequality in India. A lot of studies have been done after that, and a lot of debate has also ensued after this kind of theorization. People have been talking about, why is caste the only identity? Is that the only identity, configuration of identity? Are there no other identities than caste? Then when this question of protective discrimination was raised, in the Indian constitution, you all know, there is a provision for protective discrimination, and political reservation was made mandatory. But it was only for 10 years. So that also has been come into debate, that do we talk of affirmative action, do we talk of protective discrimination, do we talk of reservations, and do we talk of reservation of OBCs, do we talk of excluding the creamy layer from this whole scenario of reservations. So these again are some of the theoretical issues, conceptual issues that need to be debated, because there are conceptual distinctions between the ideas of protective discrimination, of affirmative action as it is used in the US and in the UK, and also this concept of quotas or reservation. Because, and you know, on both sides of the debate you have views, and Indian society has been acrimoniously divided over this. The pro-reservation people are talking of giving one set of arguments, merit versus reservations. The anti-reservationists are talking of reverse discrimination today. So all these issues are very important if we have to address this issue of social exclusion, because if we stick to caste-based discrimination only, then what about other categories which are also resulting in exclusion of other groups? Now coming to gender, this is a universal kind of an exclusion. I think the most basic distinction in any human society is the gender distinction. All societies, right from the beginning of the humankind, have been divided between men and women and subordination of women to men for various reasons outlined in various philosophies, various theories over all these centuries. And all these centuries and all these and all the philosophies that have come up in all these centuries have argued in favor of gender equality in one way or the other. But in practice, gender inequality still persists in India as on the global level. Now, when we apply this criterion of exclusion to the issue of gender, Dr. Rashmi will be talking about it in detail. I am just throwing some points. So, when we apply this criterion of exclusion to gender, I think the same logic should apply. I mean, should we also go in for this debate of reservations versus dignity of a woman, equal opportunity, equality of opportunity, or do we need still the support of reservations? So this debate still relevant in terms of gender as well. How do we ensure inclusion of women in a very democratic way, as inclusion of caste in a very democratic way, as inclusion of caste or regional or religious, any group in a mainstream, in our mainstream system. So the democratic structure is more important, the level playing field is more important, equality of opportunity. If we have been arguing it in our political science fora, that if we actually implement our constitution in letter and spirit, probably we will need no reservations, no affirmative action, no further inclusive policies of any kind. The problem with us has been in India that we have been trapped in exclusion and power. We have excluded groups from participation in the power mechanics, and that has resulted in exclusions of all this kind. If we follow the rule of law enshrined in the constitution, equality of opportunity enshrined in the constitution, legal safeguards of every individual enshrined in the constitution, probably we will not be in this situation. And the Constitution of India today also professes, sir, in the preamble of our constitution, we still have the word secularism and socialism, which is antithetical to the liberal policies, to liberalization policies, neoliberal policies that we have been adopting since 1991, which is resulting increasingly in a lopsided development in our country and increasingly resulting in more and more groups being excluded. The UNDP reports since 1990 have been telling us incessantly that these policies, globalizing policies, have benefited not more than top 10% of our population. Those top 10% comprise either of globally competitive skills, highly skilled professionals, even among women, or you have the capital. So if you have the capital, okay, you can compete at the global level. If you have the skills, you can compete at the global level. But the remaining 90% who have neither capital nor skills are on the margins and excluded in gradations, excluded, more or less excluded from the mainstream, from enjoying the fruits of development as well as of democratic rights in our country. So these questions we need to address. As for the strategies, my submission is that if our diagnosis, the strategies always match with the diagnosis. If our diagnosis is partial, our strategies will be partial as they have been till now. Sometimes we are talking of empowerment, disempowering other groups. Sometimes we are talking of pro-poor policies, excluding the really poor, the poorest of the poor, and the triply burdened women. A Dalit woman is excluded in caste, excluded in class, excluded in any sense, gender, caste, class, religion, location. So there are so many forms and grades of exclusion that we have to think in terms of a really overhauling kind of a strategy. And in my view, this strategy can only be a transformative strategy in the spirit of the Indian Constitution, which guarantees each individual complete democratic rights and freedom to everyone. The political class has to first include people as a matter of democratic phenomenon, as a matter of democratic right, and only then probably, I'll not talk about the Gandhian vision right now or the Marxist vision. There are so many strategies available, but something on the whole has to be devised and it has to be implemented in the right spirit. That is much more important. Thank you.
Presentation which is in the pen drive. Let me just, it's been a good omen for me that Professor Asha Kaushik is sharing the session with me, and she has given you all the insights about the gender dimension and the caste class also, so I need not delve into all those issues again and again. But what I have tried to do in my presentation is that, as ma'am said, that the power is at the center. So now what we would like to look at is that how gender is excluded and what is the status of women in India per se. So I use the NFHS findings of 2005, the third round of NFHS, to prove my point and to look at how women are being excluded from day-to-day activities also. And for people like us who are sitting at this forum, who are teaching in the universities, for us this kind of exclusion is not thought of, because we feel that everybody is going to be like us, but it is not so. This is just a small slide on social exclusion which we've already done with, that Professor Kaushik already talked about, that how social exclusion is a condition or outcome, and where social identity becomes important and location becomes important. So I need not stress again on the same point, because already she has touched upon these points, but also as a multidimensional and dynamic process where we look at power also. When we look at social and political relations, it is very important to look at this, and access to organizations and institutional sites of power. Look at this slide. I am trying to show in this slide that what is the relationship between exclusion in economy, exclusion from social participation, exclusion by politics. All the three spheres which are very, very important for us, and how social exclusion takes place, whether you are excluded from access to labor, to work participation, and I will prove in the coming slides how this is taking place. If you look at the arrows, each one is leading to the other. It is very difficult to say. It is like the story of the hen came first or the egg came first. Similarly, we see that whether it is exclusion of the economy which results in social exclusion, or it is a social exclusion which leads to exclusion from the economic ideas and social participation. This is the India fact sheet, which talks about the level of India on gender-related indicators. If you look at the gender inequality index, we are at 0.617. It ranges from 0 to 1. The rank which we have got is 129 out of 146 countries. Now you can imagine, we call ourselves a very large democracy, we call ourselves a coming power, and look at us where we stand in terms of gender inequality, 129 out of 146 countries being studied. The gender empowerment measure, we are at 0.497. In 1996, we were at 0.416. So there was hardly very marginal increase in the gender empowerment measure, despite all the debate on empowerment, empowering the women. Look at political participation and decision making. 0.573 in 1996, and in 2011, we only come to 0.625. Economic participation and decision making power, the figures are there for you. This is only to show that despite what all the government has been doing, we've still not fared that well as we should have fared. If you look at the literacy rate for scheduled caste women, ma'am had said about that if it is a Dalit woman, then she's triply or 4 times or 5 times marginalized because of her condition, her space, her region, her gender, etc. And you look at literacy rate for female, ST female, you still find, even in 2011, despite all efforts on RT, etc., we still have only 47.1% women who are literate. So as against the national average of 64.2 for women, but of course men is much, much higher. If you look at the offences, in the previous session, young boy, law student had talked about offences also. Now you look at, the offences have been on the rise. From 14.1 we have gone to 18. So the offences against women are on the rise, and maternal mortality has still not gone down. From 254 we have only come down to 212 per 100,000. This is again a ranking of India on some major indices. I think if you quickly go through, everywhere India is on the lower rung. We are never on the higher rung. This is the result of NFHS third round, which I will share with you. If you look at sex ratio, because whenever we talk about women, women are first marginalized at the time of birth. The first time, feticide. So trend data based on the 3 NFHS surveys provide a decline in sex ratio, which is very well established. of the population. Though if from 2011, the ratio has been encouraging. We have reached to a 940. Females are underrepresented among births and overrepresented among death. Now this is a dilemma. We are being born less but die more. So you can see the number which reduces further. The sex ratio at birth declined with wealth. It was suggested that if economic prosperity is there, more women will be born because women will not be a burden for them. But it has been found that as the wealth increases, the sex ratio declines. It has nothing to do with wealth and poor people, suggesting that sex selection of birth is common amongst wealthier than poorer. Ultrasound tests being widely used for sex selection, with sex selection being more evident for the wealthiest. Sex ratios of all last birth and last births of sterilized women show that couples typically stop having children once they have the desired number of sons. This is from the NFHS data which we took out. The child mortality rate, defined by the number of deaths to children between age 1 and 4 per 1,000 children, reaching the age 1 is 61% higher for girls than for boys. Now imagine that if there is a chance, the 61% girls will die before they reach even 1 year of age. This is the distribution of sex ratio. If you look at 880 and below, which is the danger zone, 8 states in 2001 were below the danger zone. And in 2011, we are down to 6 now, which is a little improvement. But if you see 985 and above, only 4 states in 2001 and 7 states now in 2011. So there has been some, with the introduction of PCPND Act and the tracking on the sonography machines, some change has been seen. Literacy and educational attainment among adults. The percentage of adults who are literate is as much lower in rural than in urban areas. Nonetheless, even in urban areas, 1/4 of women and more than 1/10 of men are not literate. So women, 25% are not literate, even in urban areas where there is access to education, where there is supposedly more awareness. Gender disparity in literacy is much greater in rural area than in urban areas and declines sharply with household wealth. 41% of women and 18% of men aged 15 to 49 have never been to school. Now you can imagine talking about social exclusion when 41% of women have not gone to school as yet. I mean, this is of course 2004 and 2006, but if you look at the next survey, which